Over the skies of Burma in 1943, a B-24 burst into flames and exploded beneath the low clouds. From that fireball, an American pilot was thrown clear, hanging beneath a fragile parachute, suspended in a sky filled with danger. At that altitude, human life often exists only for an instant, decided by speed, distance, and a cold pull of the trigger. A Japanese fighter turned back. It dropped lower, closing the distance meter by meter, as if trying to clearly see the face of the man falling. Amid the roar of the engine and the violent rush of wind, the American pilot understood that time had run out. Every advantage in the air had vanished, leaving only instinct and a single choice. He drew his weapon, a pistol, in midair. 7 hours later, the man was still standing, back on the battle line, after reversing the hunt at the most fragile moment of his life. Baggett Jr. and 7 brief hours turned him from a target into a legend. March 1943. Owen J. Baggett Jr., a 22-year-old second lieutenant from Texas, was serving with a B-24 Liberator bomber squadron of the 7th Air Force, based in India. On the China-Burma, India front, a theater far from the spotlight, and deadlier in quieter ways than most, each takeoff carried no promise of return. On the 31st of March 1943, Baggett and his crew were ordered to strike a strategic bridge at Pyongyang, Burma, now Myanmar, a critical link in the Japanese supply network. The formation consisted of 12 B-24 seconds, flying deep into enemy airspace without fighter escort, staking everything on altitude, speed, and chance. None of them knew that only hours later, Baggett would emerge from that mission as the central figure in a story that defied every tactical manual. A story of courage, split-second decision-making, and a rare will to survive in World War II. That morning, the B-24 formation under the command of Colonel Conrad Nekrason pushed deeper into Burmese airspace under extreme tension. The 4-engine bombers flew in tight formation, holding steady altitude, the cockpit so quiet that every engine note and every vibration of the airframe felt amplified. Ahead, the sky was heavy with tropical moisture. Low, sagging cloud layers pressed down on the formation as it advanced into territory controlled by Japanese forces, signaling an anything but routine flight. And so it proved. With the target still ahead, dark specks suddenly emerged from the cloud edge and charged straight into the American formation. They were 13 Nakajima Ki 43 Hayabusas, fast, light, and highly maneuverable fighters of the Japanese Army Air Force. In seconds, the calm sky was torn apart by roaring engines, shells screaming through the air, and streams of tracer fire slicing across the B-24 seconds. American gunners swung their turrets and opened up from every angle, turning the flying fortresses into bristling masses of steel and gunfire. But the attackers were too many, and they held the advantage in timing and position, quickly forcing the U.S. formation onto the defensive. Amid the crossing streams of fire, one B-24 took a fatal hit. The aircraft, flown by pilot Lloyd Jensen with Owen J. Baggett Jr. in the co-pilot's seat, was pierced by 20mm cannon fire that tore through the fuselage. In an instant, glowing hot rounds punched into the massive fuel tanks filled with gasoline. Flames erupted almost immediately, racing along the length of the aircraft with unstoppable speed. The tail section was engulfed in violent fire as thick black smoke billowed forward into the cockpit, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Inside, the temperature soared, the heat crushing the chest with every breath, while oxygen bottles began detonating in bursts, like repeated hammer blows against a dying airframe. Inside the fuselage, now as hot as a furnace, Baggett and gunner Samuel Crosstick tried desperately to fight the fire, but every effort proved useless. The flames had moved beyond control, and both men knew it. The massive B-24, once a proud flying fortress, had become nothing more than a steel shell waiting to explode. Faced with a brutal choice, death by fire or a jump into enemy territory. Pilot Jensen had no time left to hesitate. He gave the order to abandon the aircraft. The intercom system had already been destroyed, forcing Baggett to rely on hand signals as he crawled through smoke and flame along the fuselage, urging each crewman to jump. He insisted on staying behind until he was certain no one remained trapped inside. The instant Baggett hurled himself out through the belly hatch, a thunderous explosion erupted behind him. The B-24 disintegrated into a massive fireball, red-hot fragments of metal scattering downward into the Burmese jungle below. The blast wave flung Baggett violently through the air, his body tumbling in chaos for several seconds before he managed to grasp the ripcord. The parachute snapped open with a violent jerk, and he began a slow descent from thousands of meters above the ground, the wind screaming past his ears like an unbroken howl. Above him, the air battle continued to rage. Baggett scanned the sky and caught sight of several other parachutes blossoming in the air, a sign that some of his crewmates had managed to escape before the aircraft exploded. The relief lasted only an instant. The Japanese fighters, having finished off their target, did not break away. They turned back, dropped lower, and began hunting the American airmen drifting beneath their parachutes like living targets. At that time, firing on pilots descending by parachute was far from uncommon, and Baggett understood all too well the ruthless intent behind it. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distance, one of his crewmates' parachutes suddenly jerked violently, the body beneath it convulsing as machine gun rounds struck home. Seconds later, the parachute hung motionless in the sky, utterly still. Then, another followed. 2 members of Baggett's crew were shot dead in midair, right before his eyes, before they could even reach the ground. The sight carved itself into Baggett's mind like a blow straight to the chest. His heart tightened. Cold sweat broke out across his body, and his breathing nearly stopped. Suspended over the Burmese sky, Baggett understood that he was no longer a pilot. He had become prey. Now, all he could do was hold his breath and wait, uncertain when the next burst of gunfire would arrive. A sharp, piercing whistle tore through the air, brief and razor-like as a blade slicing past his ear. Baggett had no time to process it before a searing pain erupted in his left arm. Blood burst out, soaking the thick sleeve of his flight jacket. A round from the Japanese fighter had grazed him at lethal distance, ripping through cloth and flesh, leaving behind a burning wound, as if the skin had been seared red-hot. The jolt of pain triggered a reflexive spasm, his body curling inward as the parachute lurched violently, the suspension lines snapping taut and shuddering in the fierce wind. In that instant, Baggett had to summon every ounce of willpower to keep from screaming. He clenched his teeth so hard it felt as if his jaw might shatter, his breath locked tight in his chest. He knew it with absolute clarity. A single cry, a single panicked movement, would be enough for the enemy above to realize the target was still alive, and that would bring another burst of fire, this time without a near miss. And that was exactly what happened. The Japanese fighter that had just fired did not break away. It pulled up and came around again. Baggett sensed it through the changing rhythm of the engine, deeper now, slower, like the growl of a predator that had fixed its attention on its final prey. The Japanese pilot did not rush the kill. He wanted certainty. Facing death only seconds away, Baggett forced himself into a ruthless calm. He drew in a slow breath, ignoring the pain spreading along his arm, ignoring the blood still seeping out with each shudder of the parachute. From this moment on, he understood. Every instinctive reaction had become an enemy. One mistimed movement, and he would die in the Burmese sky. The Ki-43 Hayabusa, painted a dark green with a bright red roundel on its wing, was circling back. Its speed dropped noticeably. This was no longer a high-speed attack. It was an inspection. The Japanese pilot wanted a clear look at the American hanging beneath the parachute. Wanted to be certain he was looking at a corpse rather than a survivor. Baggett understood it in a heartbeat. And he made a decision as cold as it was terrifying. He would play dead. His body went completely slack. Every muscle released as if life had already drained away. His head fell forward onto his chest, his chin resting against the collar of his flight jacket. His legs hung limp and weightless. Only one thing did not loosen its grip. His right hand, still lightly clenched around the pistol hidden tight against his thigh, his finger already set on the trigger. From a distance, Baggett looked no different from the crewmates who had been shot down moments earlier. A motionless body suspended in the sky, held aloft only by a few taut parachute lines. He forced his breathing to slow, nearly stopping it altogether, careful not to let the canopy shudder even once more. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, each second dragging on with the weight of a full minute. The fighter began its dive. No gunfire followed. It closed in deliberately, cautiously. Baggett felt the wind intensify, the roar of the engine hammering straight into his chest. The parachute lurched violently as turbulent air from the aircraft's wings swept past. The distance between them collapsed rapidly, from hundreds of meters to dozens, then down to barely 10. At that range, there was no longer an air battle. There were only two human beings, one seated inside a steel cockpit, the other hanging exposed in open sky. Through a barely opened eye, Baggett saw what made his heart race. The Japanese pilot had slid the cockpit canopy open. He leaned out, tilting his body to one side to get a clear look at the corpse swaying in front of him. Sunlight flashed across his flight helmet and goggles. At this distance, Baggett could see the movement of the pilot's head, could see the cold curiosity in the gesture itself. In that instant, everything seemed to freeze. The wind, the engine noise, the pain in his arm, all fell away. Inside Baggett's mind, only one thought remained, sharp and mercilessly clear. This is it. The Colt M1911 lay pressed tight against Baggett's thigh, a standard sidearm, chambered in 45-inch ACP, designed for close range and for desperate moments when everything else had failed. No training manual ever taught pilots to use a pistol against an aircraft. Its effective range was measured in mere tens of meters, with no proper sights and no stability. In theory, it was a meaningless option. But at that moment, Baggett had no other choice. Hanging beneath a parachute over the skies of Burma, hunted like a living target, that small pistol was the only thing he had left. The instant the Japanese pilot leaned out of the cockpit, Baggett stopped thinking. Instinct, experience, and desperation fused into a single motion. He raised the gun. His right arm shot straight out. His wrist locked rigid despite the wind hammering against it. In that brief fraction of a second, the world went silent. The engine noise vanished. The wind disappeared. All that remained was a thin, invisible line between the muzzle of the pistol and the enemy cockpit. Baggett pulled the trigger. Then again, and again. 4 shots cracked in rapid succession, dry and sharp. The report of the M1911 torn apart by the rushing air the instant it left the barrel. At a distance of only a few dozen meters, the Japanese pilot jerked violently. The head that had just emerged from the cockpit froze for a split second that felt impossibly long, then collapsed forward onto the control stick. There was no shout, no attempt to evade, just an immediate, final collapse. The Japanese fighter lurched wildly. Its nose dropped, the wings shuddering out of control. For a heartbeat, it seemed to hang in the air, as if slammed by an invisible brake, then tipped forward and plunged into a deadly spiral. Baggett held his breath, his eyes locked on the falling aircraft. He watched it drive straight down into the jungle, vanish beneath the thick canopy, and moments later, a column of black smoke rose from the valley floor. Only then did Baggett realize that he was shaking. The hand holding the pistol still hung, suspended in the air, fingers locked tight, as if they could not yet accept that it was over. His breathing came in rapid bursts, his chest rising and falling, his heart pounding so hard it felt almost audible. A wordless question spun through his mind. Did I really just do that? One pilot, one pistol, and a fighter aircraft, an outcome no training manual had ever imagined. Later, that moment would make Owen Baggett the only person in World War II recorded as having shot down an enemy aircraft with a handgun. But here and now, in a sky still thick with danger, there was no time to think about history or legend. He knew only one thing. He was still alive. The danger had not passed. Other Japanese fighters had seen their comrade go down. They immediately broke formation and turned toward him in fury. Gunfire ripped through the air again, tearing past Baggett, shredding pieces of parachute fabric, snapping his body violently with each surge of turbulent wind. Yet, somehow, not a single round struck him. Perhaps they believed the man beneath the parachute was already dead. Perhaps they saw no reason to waste ammunition on what seemed a hopeless target. After a brief pursuit, the Japanese aircraft finally broke off, leaving behind an empty sky and a silence that felt almost unreal. Only then did Baggett truly exhale. His body slackened, strength draining away after the relentless tension of those moments. Below him, the dark green canopy of the Burmese jungle slowly grew larger. The parachute swayed gently, carrying him downward. When his feet finally touched the ground, Baggett collapsed onto the damp earth, one hand sinking into the mud, his breathing ragged but steady. He had made it back to the ground. But this was only the beginning of the fight to survive. As soon as he slipped the parachute straps from his shoulders, Owen J. Baggett Jr. froze for several seconds, forcing himself not to move too quickly. After everything that had just happened in the sky, he understood one thing with absolute clarity. Surviving the landing did not mean safety. Burma, in 1943, was no neutral ground. This was territory firmly under Japanese control, where the appearance of any American meant immediate pursuit. Around Baggett stretched dense jungle. Sunlight was filtered through thick layers of leaves, broken into dim, uneven patches, while the air hung heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying foliage. The constant drone of insects filled the forest, seemingly harmless yet intensifying the sense of isolation to a chilling degree. Baggett raised his right hand to his chest and felt his heart still pounding wildly, so hard it seemed almost audible. His left arm throbbed with pain, sharp waves radiating from the wound and forcing him to grit his teeth. Every movement brought a burning sensation, like flames licking into the flesh. Yet amid the pain and utter exhaustion, one thought held fast in his mind, clearer than anything else. He was alive. After the aircraft had exploded, after watching crewmates shot down in midair, after a shot that defied every rule he had ever known, he was still standing here. And in war, that alone was a rare gift. Baggett forced himself back into the present. If he remained here too long, Japanese patrols or armed local militia would inevitably appear. He crouched low, gathered the parachute, folded it as tightly as he could, and shoved it deep into the undergrowth to keep it hidden from aerial view or from eyes trained to read the jungle. Then he began to move, slowly and carefully, one step at a time, doing everything possible to keep noise to a minimum. Every snapped twig beneath his boot, every dry leaf crushed underfoot made him pause, listening for several seconds before moving on again. A fragile hope flickered in Baggett's mind. Perhaps others had survived as well. He recalled the moment in the air when he had seen several other parachutes blossom open. Not everyone had been shot down. If he could find his crewmates, their chances of survival would multiply. Together, they could support one another, make clearer decisions, instead of facing the jungle alone. Before long, faint sounds ahead told Baggett that he was not by himself. He stopped, pressed close to a large tree, his hand resting on the pistol. A figure emerged through the leaves, moving unsteadily, a flight suit smeared with mud. When Baggett recognized the familiar face, relief washed over him. It was pilot Lloyd Jensen, the man who had been flying the doomed B-24. He was still alive, shaken and scraped, but otherwise intact. The two men looked at each other for a moment, then, without a word, moved quickly together and clasped hands, as if to confirm that this was real and not an illusion. Only minutes later, they found Samuel Crosstick, the gunner who had fought alongside Baggett against the fire inside the aircraft. Crosstick was more badly battered, his clothes torn, but his eyes were clear. 3 men, 3 lives pulled back from the edge of death, stood together in the Burmese jungle, unable to hold back their emotions. They embraced, ragged breaths mixing with laughter caught in their throats. It was not pure joy, but the fragile feeling of those who had just stepped out of hell, with no idea what still lay ahead. In that moment, Baggett's spirits lifted noticeably. He was no longer alone. The 3 men quickly agreed that they had to leave the area as soon as possible. Their only objective was to find a way back to Allied lines, or at the very least make contact with local civilians who were not aligned with the Japanese and might offer help. They had no map, no compass, no food, relying only on judgment and limited survival experience. Yet at that point, inaction was the most dangerous choice of all. They began moving in the direction they believed led west, toward areas where Allied forces were operating. The Burmese jungle unfolded like a living maze. Vines tangled around them, tree roots jutted up from the ground, and mud mixed with slick stones made every step a drain on their strength. The hot, humid air soaked them in sweat, clinging to their clothes and making the wound on Baggett's arm burn even more fiercely. Each time they paused for a brief rest, he clenched his teeth, enduring the pain so as not to show weakness in front of the others. Time dragged by with cruel slowness. The sun climbed overhead and then began to slide westward, the light filtering through the canopy, shifting from harsh white to a dull golden hue. Nearly 7 hours had passed since the moment the B-24 was hit and Baggett had been forced to jump. Those 7 hours contained a lifetime. Aerial combat, free fall, a gunshot in midair, and now a tense escape behind enemy lines. For Baggett, time was no longer measured in hours. It had become a series of trials, each one demanding a choice between life and death in every passing moment. Despite his exhaustion, Baggett forced himself to stay alert. He constantly scanned the ground for signs, footprints, broken branches, narrow trails that might mark patrol routes. Every unfamiliar sound made all 3 men stop, holding their breath as they listened. One thought kept repeating in Baggett's mind. Just a little farther. If they could make it through the afternoon, darkness might offer better cover. If they could endure the night, their chances of survival would improve. But war rarely granted such easy chances. Late in the afternoon, as the 3 followed a dry stream bed in search of water and a way to mask their tracks, shouts suddenly rang out from multiple directions. In an instant, Baggett understood their mistake. The stream was not just a source of water, but a common route of movement. From the surrounding brush, a group of Burmese militia emerged, weapons in hand, their expressions wary and cold. They were local forces armed and trained by the Japanese to hunt down Allied airmen who came down in this area, men who knew the jungle better than anyone. Baggett and his 2 companions were quickly surrounded. Exhausted, with no cover and no escape route, any thought of resistance was futile. They were disarmed, bound, and marched out of the jungle. As he walked, Baggett felt a hollow emptiness spread through his chest. 7 hours of survival had just passed, and now, instead of reaching American lines as he had hoped, he had fallen into enemy hands. On the night of the 31st of March 1943, Baggett was handed over to Japanese forces and quickly taken in for interrogation, then transferred through several prison camps before being sent to Changi Prison in Singapore, a place whose name alone was enough to make many prisoners of war shudder. Changi was notorious for its brutal discipline, chronic food shortages, and inhumane living conditions. For many, it marked the end of hope, but for Baggett, something unusual occurred. Word of the gunshot in midair reached the camp commander. Instead of immediate torture, the Japanese officer received Baggett with an unexpected attitude, a mixture of curiosity and admiration. In the militaristic culture of wartime Japan, individual bravery, even that of an enemy, could be regarded in a different light. According to later accounts, the commander even offered Baggett the opportunity to perform harakiri, presenting it as an honorable death reserved for a courageous warrior. Exhausted but clear-minded, Baggett flatly refused. For more than 2 years that followed, Baggett lived the life of a prisoner of war. Hunger, disease, forced labor, and moments that seemed impossible to survive. Death came close, many times. Yet it was those 7 hours of survival on the day of his shootdown that forged something essential within him: the ability to endure, and the belief that even in the worst circumstances, a person could hold on if he did not give up. And Baggett did hold on, until the war finally ended, and he was at last able to return. In August 1945, as the final gunfire of World War II faded away, the balance of the world shifted in just a few short days. The Japanese Empire announced its unconditional surrender. For millions of Allied soldiers, it was the moment of going home. But for Owen J, Baggett Jr., it was the first time he truly stepped out of the war. At Changi Prison in Singapore, a place that had become a symbol of brutality, hunger, and despair, Baggett and 37 other prisoners of war were freed in a swift yet tense operation carried out by the American OSS. When U.S. soldiers appeared beyond the prison gates, Baggett did not cheer or break down in tears. He simply stood still for a few seconds, as if needing to be certain that what he was seeing was not another illusion. More than 2 years of captivity, more than 2 years living on the fragile line between life and death, had taught him to restrain emotion. Only after stepping beyond the gates and drawing a deep breath of free air did Baggett fully grasp that he had survived the war in its entirety. Upon returning to the United States, the story of the pilot shot down over Burma spread quickly. Yet what stunned people was not his survival after bailing out, nor the harsh years he endured as a prisoner of war. It was the 7-hour ordeal in which a man hanging in the sky, armed with nothing but a pistol, reversed the roles of hunter and prey. The story of shooting down an aircraft with a handgun circulated through military units, appeared in newspapers, and then reached the wider public as a tale that defied every conventional notion of how war was supposed to be fought. After the war, several Japanese officers who had served in the Burma theater confirmed that during that period, a Japanese pilot had been killed with a .45 caliber gunshot wound to the head, consistent with Baggett's account. Those confirmations added weight to the story. Even so, history, by its very nature unforgiving, leaves gaps. Japanese Air Force records do not list an aircraft shot down on that day, and for that reason, debates surrounding the midair gunshot have continued to this day. Yet one fact remains beyond dispute: Baggett survived an attempted execution in the air, and no one disputes that those 7 hours fundamentally changed the course of his life. In war, not every truth fits neatly into official records, and not every decisive moment is fully documented. Sometimes history is preserved in the memories of those who survived, and in the quiet acknowledgement of men who once stood on opposite sides. After recovering, Owen Baggett did not leave the skies behind. He continued to serve in the United States Air Force for decades, witnessing the world's transition from propeller-driven aircraft to the jet age, and from World War II into the Cold War. He rose to the rank of colonel, following a steady but unassuming career path, and retired in 1973. Returning to Texas, Baggett lived a quiet life, far from the spotlight. He rarely volunteered the story of 1,943, and when asked, he usually answered briefly, as if it were a memory carefully stored away, not meant for display. In 2006, Owen J. Baggett passed away at the age of 85. There was no grand memorial service and no towering monument. Yet his name continues to be spoken, not as that of a general or a manufactured hero, but as a man who faced the most desperate moment of his life and did not step back. The story of 7 hours of survival over the skies of Burma is more than a wartime anecdote. It is a stark reminder of the true nature of combat, a place where plans can collapse, advantages can vanish, and the only thing left is the ability to stay calm and make a decision in a matter of seconds. Owen Baggett's legacy does not rest on whether a handgun could truly bring down an aircraft. It rests on what a human being is capable of when pushed to the absolute limit. In that moment, Baggett was not fighting to become a legend. He was fighting to stay alive. And it was precisely that calm, that decisiveness, and that refusal to surrender, which allowed his story to transcend the war itself, becoming a quiet symbol of human strength in the face of the harshest circumstances imaginable.